Well, people, gosh, it's good to see y'all. All right, Christmas is right here. Looks like everybody's pretty happy and maybe even in the spirit a bit. And that's a good thing. I've got a mug full of coffee here and I'm pretty happy with that. And while I'm sipping it, I'd like to tell you another story. I'd like to tell you some more of a story that we've been telling for a while now. You know, it's a Max Brand story. It's Dan Barry's daughter. And we're all the way up to chapter 10. It's a little bit interesting. We're doing the background on this gal. Looks like she's going to get in some trouble just like her dad did. Well, let's take a listen. Chapter 10, it's the nickname that counts. "Why the devil," said Sheriff Sim Hargis, "do you waste all that fine singing on the empty night? You might get paid for it in town." "Well, I'm a gent, open-minded by nature," declared Harry Gloucester. "I like to give things away, including my songs." "Well, I got to say," growled the sheriff, "is that you might save your singing for them that would appreciate it a pile more than I would." "Well, I ain't singing to you," declared the prisoner, who was chained to the seat besides the sheriff. "I'm singing to the world in general. How do you know what might be hearing me?" "Well, a coyote, maybe, taking lessons off yonder on a hill," suggested the sheriff. "Maybe," said Gloucester with the most perfect good nature. "I wouldn't grudge him none. Speaking of singing, the drinks are on me and I'm setting up to entertain." "Rats," said the sheriff, "you talk plumb foolish." "You ain't got no heart in you," said Gloucester. "What functions for you is just a chunk of the law. If I was to shake you, I could hear the pages rustle. Otherwise, you'd see that I was overflowing with happiness." "Well, I never took none to singing," observed the sheriff dryly. "Well, don't give up trying, though," urged Gloucester. "Now listen to this." And tilting back his head, his voice rose and sang, "Que viva la rumba, que viva placer, que viva las niñas chulitas bonitas, y gapas que saben correr." The sheriff groaned as that last note floated afar, and then, out of the thin distance, a coyote wailed in answer. "Well, you've waked 'em up," grinned the sheriff. "You got your audience, I see. Where'd you learn that fool thing?" "Mexico." "Well, for Mexico it might do," said the sheriff pointedly. You're talking sort of straight," said Harry Gloucester suddenly. "Well, that's me. I always make a habit of talking more right out what I mean." "Then swallow your tongue when you're talking to me," said Gloucester, and turning in the seat as much as his handcuffs and the chain permitted, he stared fixedly into the face of Sim Hargis. "I don't need your conversation to make me happy." The sheriff met that cold eye for an instant. Then he turned his attention back to the span of his mustangs. He felt, in fact, that he had gone too far, and like every man who felt that he was in the wrong, he was beginning to hate his companion. But after a moment of silence, he found that his anger was dissipating. He was a man among men, was Sim Hargis. And presently he said, "I guess you're right, partner. You got a right to sing if you want to. I'm kind of out of sorts tonight." "Well, I'm sorry for that," replied the other amiably. "What's wrong, may I ask?" "Well, I got a fine little sorrel filly. She went lame on me this morning." "Why, that's sure tough," agreed Gloucester. "Let me have a look at her when we have a chance. I know something about a hoss." He turned and looked back to his own mount trotting contentedly behind the buckboard, swinging over to one side to get free from the dust. "Yep, that's a good one you got for yourself. Not bad. We've been so doggone busy that I forgot to ask your name." "Oh, Sandy Williams," said Gloucester. "That is my name." "Yeah, I mean your real name." "Well, that's it." The sheriff laughed. "You waited just a minute too long before you spoke," he said, "but we'll let it go at that, Sandy. And by the way, where'd you learn how to handle your fists? You been in the ring?" "Nope." "Well, you ain't, but you sure can step. I started out to get you as soon as that fight begun. You didn't want that mob to smash you all up. But when I seen your style, I thought I'd wait and let you work." "Well, thanks," said Gloucester. "It was a fine little party while it lasted." "Yeah, while it lasted, it sure was." Well, they reached the town, and presently the jail. It was a snug little building, recently built, and the sheriff was immoderately proud of his accommodations. "The wall's 1.5 feet thick," he said, tapping on it. "All hard stone, too, and these here bars are all tool-proof stuff. There ain't no better made steel." Harry Gloucester paused on his way down the aisle and gripped a bar in his manacled hands. There was a convulsive twist of his shoulders, and that great steel framework shuddered violently. In the distance, a lock began to swing and jingle. "Well, you're big," muttered the sheriff, watching closely. "But you're stronger than you look by a pile." "Well, I sure hope that I don't have to bust out and spoil all your decorations," said Harry Gloucester politely. "I'd hate to leave a hole in that wall." The sheriff grinned at him, led him on to the door, which the deputy, who acted as a jailer, he'd opened it before them. There were 12 cells on the floor, each one surrounded by open bars. It was possible to survey every cell in detail at just a glance. Into one of these Gloucester was led and the irons removed. He was made comfortable. Fresh drinking water was brought to fill his pitcher, and then he was locked in for the night and left reclining on his bunk and smoking a cigarette with a meditative air of content. "You had a look at him?" asked Sim Hargis of his deputy when they were seated in the office a moment later. "Had you had a good look at him, George?" "Well, fair to middling." "Well, if you was to pick out a nickname to fit him, what would you land on?" George studied a moment. "Well, I might call him Little Joe or Happy or something like that." The sheriff nodded. "Little Joe would be a fit," he declared, "but how would Sandy do?" "Sandy? His hair's too yaller for any name like that, don't you figure? But how come you're aiming to pick out a name for him, Sim?" "They said he was called Sandy Williams." He paused again. "How did he look to you, George?" "Sort of good-natured." "Well, you wouldn't mind getting into a fracas with him?" George reached for his gun. Instinct and much training at the draw made that gesture lightning fast. "Not if there was enough light for straight shooting," he said, with a rather twisted grin. "Well, that's the way I figured it," nodded the sheriff, and he frowned very seriously. "George, that feller's got a record of some sort." "He has? What is it?" "Well, I don't know. I'm going to find out. He wouldn't be traveling with a crooked name if there wasn't something wrong with him. We'll have to look around the country and listen in on what we can, and take a telegram down to the office, will you?" And so, before many minutes, a message was ticking across the wires, north and south and east and west, inquiring from the sheriffs of many counties if a yellow-haired man over 6 foot tall and weighing about 200 pounds, but looking 30 pounds bigger, were wanted for any crimes. But while this was going on, the yellow-haired man who weighed 200 pounds and might look to be even 30 pounds heavier, lay on his back on his bunk in the jail with his head pillowed on one thick arm, sound asleep and smiling in his dreams. Chapter 11. The Happy Prisoner. It had been the intention of Lee Haines to leave that town the next morning, and he had been on his way across the veranda of the hotel after paying his bill, when he received news which halted him. A tall, well-proportioned feller with a very handsome face and black eyes under level black brows was passing. A black plaster covered one side of his chin, and the face seemed swollen and discolored. There was a chuckle from a chair nearby after the young feller passed. "Well, young Gaynor ain't going to be so darn free-handed after this," rumbled a cowpuncher, cocking his sombrero onto the back of his head. "He ain't," agreed the nearest neighbor. "He's sure got plenty. Pretty near got a busted jaw, they say. Took him 15 minutes before he could sit up and ask where he was at." There was another laugh. He swears that somebody sneaked up behind him and hit him with a crowbar on the back of the head. Yeah, it wasn't no such thing. I seen it all. He got soaked so hard that it lifted him off his feet and landed him on the back of his neck. Lee Haines, he looked thoughtfully after the retreating back of the man who had just passed. He was well above average size and solidly built. He might weigh, say, 180 pounds. And then Haines found himself subconsciously struggling to create the picture of the man who had lifted this feller off his feet with a blow, dropped him upon the back of his head. But his mind refused to function for such a purpose. He kept imagining a giant 7 foot tall with a fist as big as a water bucket. The problem fascinated him so that he turned to the cowpunchers with a question. Now, did I hear that straight? Somebody lifted him off his feet and dumped him on the back of his neck? Two grave pairs of eyes encountered him and examined him. He was a stranger, and a stranger was not to be answered in haste. But one of them decided that he would do so. Well, ain't you heard about the fracas? He asked in turn. I slept late, said Lee. A gent named Sandy Williams cleaned up John Gaynor and 6 more last night at the dance. 7 men. All of 7. It was a mighty pretty thing to watch. Drifted through 'em like quicksilver through sand. All good fighting men, too, every one of 'em. Gaynor yonder, well, he spent a lot of time on boxing lessons. What's Sandy? Is he a giant? The two considered the question soberly. Well, he looks bigger than he is, one said, and the second agreed to that. Now, Lee Haines recalled the stalwart who had walked into that hotel dining room the very day before, but who, when he sat down, was hardly higher at the shoulder than Lee himself. And he recalled, too, the blows that had dropped Joe MacArthur and left him senseless. Has he got a bush of curly yeller hair, he asked. Do you know him? They asked in chorus. He's a stranger around these parts. Now, I've seen him. Seems to be quite a man. They declared fervently that he was the 2 men rolled into one, and there followed a graphic description of the fight. Which he was laughing all the way through, one declared. You'd have thought that he was dancing or something like that. Why, he took everything plumb easy, floated around and jerked his fists into him, and every punch was like the tap of a sledgehammer. I knew a man once, began Lee Haines, and then his voice trailed away and his glance was lost in that sweep of a distant cloud. What's become of Sandy? Jail. Huh? $500 bail for disturbing the peace, they say, but take it by and large, it was a mighty great disturbance. Judge Connolly'll give him about 5 days in jail, let him think things over, and then turn him loose. Connolly is a good sort. He talks mighty loud, but the things he says ain't so bad. Now, Lee Haines forgot the journey which was before him. Instead, he went to that jail, and there he interviewed George, the deputy and the jailkeeper. Well, how's the patient? He asked. Well, he wants more ham and eggs. It'd bust the county to feed 2 like him. He's all stomach. Well, may I see him? Well, everybody else has seen him. I guess you can, nodded George. Might think he was a ghost and not a man the way folks come around to stare at him. Does he mind it? Well, not him. He's got a word for 'em all. He'll have a word for you. You watch. He escorted Haines into the main room of the jail and then sank onto a stool. Don't try to pass him nothing. I'm watching, he yawned. Darned if I ain't tired out. Well, there he is. It was more than Haines had dared to hope for. He went hurriedly down that aisle between the rows of bars, and presently he was before the cell in which was Harry Gloucester, alias Sandy Williams. And he found Harry on his knees, working with a deft and hasty pencil on the smooth stone flagon, which had been whitened by much scrubbing. And growing upon the floor was the face of a girl, shadowy, coming out of a mist of many lines in the background. All that was real of her features and expression was the big eyes and their straight, far-off look, and the curving smile faint upon her lips. One might have said that it was a portrait of every pretty girl in the world. Certainly it was a picture of no individual. There were too many places where the imagination was left to do as it pleased. "Well, who's that?" asked Haynes. The other whirled on him. "Another?" he growled, and then seeing who it was, he arose to his feet with a smile. "Well, hello, Haynes," he said. "Things been happening since I saw you last." "Quite a lot," nodded Lee Haynes. "You got into one mess on my account. Now you're in another on your own account. Now what I've come to find out is this. Just how important is it for you to get across that border?" The other considered with a perfect gravity. "The difference is between living and dying. Take it by and large," he said, and he actually grinned at Haynes. "Yeah, I thought it was something like that," nodded Haynes, without showing the slightest surprise or shock. "What the devil made you hang around here all day yesterday?" No reason, just 'cause I was a fool." "And why'd you fight last night?" "Been a month since I had a good fight." "That's not true. You mixed with Joe MacArthur yesterday afternoon." "It wasn't a fight. He just did the receiving. I got the jump on him, you see." Lee Haynes sighed. "You're a queer one," he declared. "Is that the girl you left behind you?" He pointed down to the floor. "Hell, that's the girl I haven't seen yet," he said. "What's that? The one you dreamed about, eh?" "More than that. I heard her voice once." "What sort of crazy talk?" began Haynes, and then he shook his head. "You're past me, partner. Where'd you pick up the knack? That looks like professional work to me." "I've always handled a pencil and paints when I run into 'em. My father showed me how when I was a kid." "Your father?" "Up in Colorado, you know, consumption." Haynes nodded. "Is it straight that your bail is $500? Something like that." "Son, I've got less than $100 with me." "Why, Haynes, I didn't expect you to help me out of this boat. You didn't put me in here. It's not your party." "I believe you mean it," said Haynes, gnawing his lip thoughtfully. "But you saved me yesterday. You expect me to ride along and let you rot today? But there are things about me you don't know yet, partner. I'm going to have you out of this." "Well, that's sure fine of you, Haynes. The thing to do, of course, is to get that bail money before they find out what's agin you and hold you without bail." "Well, that's a natural way of going about it, I should say. Tell me just one thing. If they get you for whatever else you're accused of, are they sure to convict you?" "On the testimony against me, they could hang 10 men. Haynes looked at him sharply. He had spent more than half of a wild life among criminals of one kind or another, but he could not place the open face of Harry Gloucester in that category. Unless a sudden burst of passion, that he decided, must be it. The outthrust of the jaw, the imperious nose, the restless eye, were all typical of a highly excitable nature. And while he paused, a small thread of singing came wavering into the jail through a barred window which was open. Que viva la rumba, que viva placer. "Oh, Lord!" cried Harry Gloucester, and suddenly his shrill whistle caught up the air. Que viva las niñas chulitas bonitas, y gapas que saben querer. "Is that a signal?" asked Haynes. But Gloucester, a man transformed with happy excitement, returned no answer. He did not even speak when Haynes bade him farewell and left the jail. Chapter 12. A Vain Sacrifice. Well, there was a swirl of people before the veranda of the hotel when Haynes stepped down from the door of the jail. The group was constantly recruited. It revolved around a shining bay horse of which Haynes could see the tossed head and shining coat only by glimpses through the crowd. But what chiefly held his eye, and the eye of all the others, was a girl standing on the verge of the veranda with her hand raised as if asking for attention. And she was getting it in a rush. The hat, which she had been waving to call attention, was in her hand. Her head was exposed, covered with a softly waved mass of golden hair. The metal gold which turns to fire when the sun strikes on it. And her flushed face, Her eager eyes drew men as honey draws flies. Lee Haines was past the days of romance, perhaps, but nevertheless he hastened with the others towards that focal point. "Say it over again," someone was calling as he arrived. "We're late. We didn't hear you the first time." "Well, I'm going to sell this horse to the highest bidder," the girl answered. "You can try out his paces if you wish, but I'll give you my word that he's gentle." And there was a deep hum of chuckling from the crowd. Not a man there who did not enjoy a little pitching when he swung into the saddle of a morning. It was the quickest way of warming up both man and beast for the day's work. "Well, let's have a look at him," they began to urge. "Get out of the way, Shorty. You got a chance to size up the hoss. Let me have a look, Sam." But those in the front rank, merely turning their heads with grins, announced that they had the first seats and they intended to hold 'em, come what might. And so that little crowd became a heavily jammed mass. And when a newcomer strove to press through, he might send a wave of motion through the whole group, but he could not dislodge a single man. But now no one was looking at the horse, you see. Instead, there was a profound concentration of attention upon the face of the girl. They gazed silently, with great wide eyes, which banished the man in their faces and let the boy shine through. They dwelt on her timidity, shrinking before so many eyes, and on her courage, which spurred her on and brought that high color into her cheeks. And they drank in the delicate contours of her face and her throat, forever changing as she turned her head. It was as if a wild creature had dared to come in among the inhabitations of man in the middle of the day. An aroma of strangeness hung around her. "Who is it?" whispered Haines, laying his hand on the shoulder of the man that stood in front of him. There was no answer. Who is it?" he repeated, increasing the strong pressure of his fingers. His hand was struck away, but there was no other retort. And in the meantime, the girl was apparently embarrassed and bewildered by the battery of eyes which searched her with never a pause. She reached down and, putting her hand under the chin of Peter, raised his head. "Can you all see him?" she asked. "Scatter out, you there in front," came a roar of voices from the rear. "We can't see nothing." Of course, it was not Peter they alluded to, and although they were close enough to see the girl, Lee Haines did not blame them for wanting to be closer. He wished to be closer himself. He felt a tingle of pleasure at the thought of standing nearby, as though, indeed, she were surrounded by an electric atmosphere. And he knew that a close eye would find no imperfections, that the careful examination would reveal no trace of wrinkles around the eyes, no weariness about the mouth. It was as if the freshness of the dawn were to step into the middle of the noonday and refuse to fade with all its delicate colors. "Peter, dear," he heard the voice of the girl saying, and his heart melted at the sound. "Come up here where they can see you. Good boy, up." She clapped her hands together, leaning and smiling down to the horse. And up he leapt like a dog and whirled hastily to keep his eye on this unaccustomed crowd. There was a rumble of admiration and applause for both the girl and the horse. And indeed, Peter was as worthy of attention as the girl in his own way. He stood not more than an inch or two over 15 hands, and he was delicately made, but every scruple of his body was formed with a perfect hand. He could have stepped into a book as a type of what a horse should be, and yet he had strength as well. One could see that he could run smoothly and as long as a clock could tick. And there was a cat-like nimbleness about him. As he stood on the boards of the veranda, shifting his feet as he felt the old wood yield under him, he gave an impression of wonderful lightness, as though he would have bounded the next instant over the heads of the crowd and darted away for freedom. Into the place which he had left vacant at the edge of the veranda the crowd had washed instantly. A thick row of sombreros tilted up as their wearers stared at that girl. "Here is Peter," she said, and she extended a hand toward him. He pricked his ears and thrust out his nose to sniff at it. "And oh, if I should tell you what a good horse he is, you'd hardly be able to believe." "We'll believe," rumbled someone, and there was an eloquent grunt from the others. They would have believed anything from her lips, felt Lee Haines. Now, he was ready for the same thing himself. You won't have to chase him across fields the way I've seen some people chasing their horses. When you go to the fence and call, he'll come to you, and if you haven't any sugar, he's just as happy. There was a faint chuckle from the crowd. The thought of carrying sugar for a horse was a stretch outside of their imaginations. You won't need a whip or spurs for Peter. He'll run till his heart breaks for you. Her eyes grew bright with tears, so great was her earnestness. And quite forgetting all her timidity in this enthusiasm for Peter, she stood straighter, and her voice rose a little, and she passed an affectionate arm under Peter's head, and he stood as still as a rock. And he always is the same. He's never tired. You can ride him every day. He'll never be lame. He's true gold all the way through. On my honor. She paused, drew another breath. I have to sell him, she said sadly, to some man who will be kind to him, I know. For who could help being kind to Peter? She paused again with a hand extended frankly as though to invite them into her perfect confidence in all mankind. There was a little sway and a stir in the crowd as every man vainly strove to get closer. And so, if anyone will offer a price, I'll say 300, said one. 350, 4, 500, 550. It was so much money for cattlemen to pay for a horse, but Lee Haines knew that they were bidding for a smile from the girl, not for the horse itself. And though yonder in the jail was a man to whom he owed his life, and for whom he would have laid down his own safety, yet he knew that if he had that money in his pocket, he would have joined the most enthusiastic bidders. The mere cowpunchers had drawn away a little, hopeless, when they saw no such money offered. It was only the ranchers who were calling now. But the voice of Joan halted them, saying, 500 is what I need. Who offered that? Aye, came the shout, and there were 6 other voices in it. She shook her head bewildered. Who offered it? She asked. I offered it, said Jud Carter, pushing his giant form through the crowd. Then Peter is yours. There was a shout of protest from the others. He was up for the highest bidder, lady. You got to sell him that way. But 500, she argued, is all that I need. Poor Peter, good boy. A wave of grief called her attention from the men to the horse beside her, and the demands of the higher bidder were as suddenly forgotten. And here, said Jud Carter, climbing to her side, is the coin. Lucky I had it handy with me. He removed his hat with a flourish, very conscious that he was making a picture which would be long remembered, and not at all aware that it would be remembered mostly because it was ridiculous in the contrast of the slender girl, graceful as music, with his bony, hard-twisted body as he leaned over her. She took that money. She rewarded poor Jud with a trembling smile, and then threw her arms round Peter. A gaping crowd saw the tears tumble out of her eyes, saw her lift her head and press her cheek against the muzzle, and then she was gone, while Peter turned and trotted after her, raising a cloud of dust from the veranda flooring. Jud Carter, by a burst of sprinting, captured that horse and led him down to the ground, and there he was surrounded by a clamorous crowd, laughing and roaring out 100 comments. But Joan had hurried straight down the street with a step as free and athletic as the stride of a boy, and so she came to the courthouse and the city hall, combined in one wide, low-fronted building. From the old pensioner at the door, she asked the way to Judge Conley's office. In the ancient unkinked his back and strode, grinning beside her, until he had brought her to the sanctum of the judge himself. They are all kind, thought Joan as she entered the office of the judge. All these men are so gentle. I wondered why my mother wanted to keep me away from them. Why could it be? So she stood in front of Judge Conley, who, as he turned in his swivel chair, was encountered by the eloquent wink of an old man who was just closing the door. Therefore, the judge, to cover a responsive grin, had to frown and clear his throat, a proceeding which made Joan take a step back. He seated her in another moment, however, and when all the wrinkles were out of his forehead, it seemed to Joan that he was like all the rest of his kind, overflowing with good nature and eagerness to help her. And as he drew the chair out of the shaft of sunlight and waved her into it, he remained leaning over it and one hand rested on the arm. It brought him so close to Joan that she had to lean farther back in the chair to smile up at him. But smile she did, although there was a wild riot of fear and hope and grief for Peter. In her heart, she had been beginning to find that the smiles worked wonderfully well with men. A smile struck a light into their eyes, made them alert, suppled the very joints of their limbs. And so it was with the judge now. He beamed down upon her, a veritable rain of goodwill. "And what's the trouble now?" he asked. "What's the trouble? Since nothing but trouble brings people to me, let's start right in with your name, and then we'll go through with the rest of the story." "Joan Daniels," she answered. The judge recoiled, struck the back of his knees upon the edge of his swivel chair, and sat down heavily within it. The force jogged the spectacles low on his chin, and the knowledge that he had appeared ungraceful made him scowl to recover his lost ground. "Ah," said he, "then you're the one that I've heard of, that lives all by herself with a silent man for a father. Well, well, I've heard a good deal about you." She shook her head, saying that she did not know who could have talked about her, because she knew no one. But she had heard that he was the man to whom one came when one wished to pay a bail. "A bail?" exclaimed the judge, starting in his chair, then rocking far back in it until his short legs swung clear of the floor. "Bail? Who the devil? I mean, what bail do you want to pay?" His violence drove some of the color out of Joan's cheeks, yet she stared up at him. He sat forward again and managed to reach out and pat her hand. There, he said. "I didn't mean to frighten you. Whose bail do you want to pay?" She swallowed. "There is a man who was arrested last night. I think he's called Sandy Williams." She saw the face of the judge darken. "My dear, Miss Daniels," said the judge, "what interested you in him?" "I can't tell you that," she admitted, "but here I have the money to pay, the whole $500, you see." And she leaned forward, her eyes bright with delight. The judge, however, paid not the slightest heed to the money. Instead, he picked up a yellow telegraph slip from the desk beside him and extended it towards her. "I don't know what you know about the man. He calls himself Sandy Williams. But no matter whatever else you know about him, I imagine that you don't know this, and you ought to." She looked down at the slip of paper and saw typewritten across it in capitals, "Hold Sandy Williams until my arrival. His real name is Harry Gloucester. Wanted here for murder of Hal Springer and Rudy Nichols last week. $2,000 will be paid to..." And that brief remainder danced into a smudge of black. Well, and that, folks, there's a pretty good setup there for the next go-round. Now, what is this poor gal going to do with this crazy old outlaw? Well, love is blind, as we know. Well, next week we'll find out. By golly, you all come back to this same fire pit. Same group of people with a few new and a few not there, and we'll have a good old time like we always do. It was good seeing you again this week. And if I don't talk to you till after Christmas, well, every one of you, enjoy your family, enjoy your friends, enjoy the cheer of the season. It's a good time to be alive, folks. Good things are coming our way. Well, till I see you again, this is Clay Steele. Have a good night.